COVID and all the rest of it. But I'm with Paul Harding, who's a local architect of long standing. I think that's fairly true to say.
Yeah, 35 years.
35 years. Now, the question is, the first question, which you'll say is so banal, does Jersey have a housing shortage?
Oh, absolutely, without a doubt.
Are there enough buildings, or is it just a distribution of buildings, or do buildings need to be divided up so that there are houses? Is it enough buildings, or is there a lack of buildings?
Well, I think the problem is that the cost of housing is such now in the island that it's very difficult for young families to afford to buy a house. And that creates a logjam right the way throughout the housing chain. And the number of clients that come to me and say, I've looked around for something that I can buy which meets my needs, and there's just nothing in my price range. It's either really crap or it's wrongly apportioned in terms of the rooms, and therefore I've decided to do an extension. Which is okay for me, very nice, thank you. We'll do a nice extension of home office or another bedroom or, various things. So, but that, I think, is symptomatic of the problem in Jersey is that a lot of the housing stock is of mediocre quality. There's been advances made in recent years in improving that, but the private sector is, there's very few housing developments available to buy.
Well, there's very few housing developments in my time in Jersey, which is to say, have achieved Parker Morris standards, which come from the 1950s, because those standards on square footage are quite generous. But even achieving that is quite difficult to achieve, or has been, because the cost that comes in to provide the space that's required.
You want to build wall floor area in each dwelling, it's going to cost more.
Absolutely.
As eggs are eggs, it's sort of an indivisible connection. We are actually now above Parker Morris standards in Jersey, since the planning minister 3 times removed increased the standards by 10%. And so I wouldn't say the standards are inadequate in terms of space provision. There are certainly developers that use the rules to maybe get around them.
Anybody who's ever tried to design a kitchen for something, if you look at Parker Morris style kitchen, it had virtually nothing in it at all. It was bare units, a fridge if you're lucky. Now, of course, you've got so many gadgets that go into the kitchen.
That's right.
It just is the work surfaces. It ceases to be a kitchen. I don't know what it's supposed to be now. So. Anyway, that's an aspect of the design. As innovative designers, what can architects do? I mean, if you go on the internet, you'll see all these variations on porta cabins, containers, shipping containers, converted into the old prefabs which came in after the war. All that style of thinking, to your mind, is that acceptable?
No, the porta cabins and converted porta cabins and sort of shoebox houses, I think, are going the wrong way in that basically they're trying to solve the price issue by dumbing down, by providing less.
Absolutely.
Yeah? And so talking about space standards, that wouldn't get approved in Jersey, because the planning standards are there, then we have to comply with them. The way to go, I think, is to firstly provide more housing, have somebody who is actually politically responsible for providing housing, which should probably be the housing minister.
But never has been, has it?
No, it hasn't.
I always remember housing ministers traditionally resist building in the countryside. Nothing to do with the housing minister. I've always thought their job is to provide houses. That's what I thought.
Yeah.
They shouldn't. That's the planner's beef is about where they shall go.
There was one time when we had what was the equivalent of housing ministers in the committee system, where the president of the housing committee was very much instrumental in providing housing.
Right.
And that was 25 years ago, but of course there's been a sea change since then in the way government operates, and now we've got ministerial government and governed by edict, and then quangos, so all the responsibilities are sort of been divulged to other arm's length organisations that have got their own financial structure to look after, and they've got to prove their existence. And so they're not innovating. But there is scope, I think, for using less land for housing, but achieving the same output.
Right. How?
By going up
By going
vertically.
Vertical development.
Gardens in the sky.
Gardens.
It's you've mentioned, Mike, about how you love the living at Lamarre, since and you have improved the standards there.
Makes a hell of a difference.
But you have great views out.
Absolutely, I got the best view in the island. I can see America.
Oh well, maybe not quite that far, but maybe France. But and so houses in the sky, called maisonettes, but with a garden on the side, open to the fresh air, is the way to go, because
They suit
and
people
we
like
can
me.
design it attractively on the outside, unlike Lamarre. I mean, tower blocks in Jersey have got a bad reputation
I've
because of
lived there for
Lamarre.
about 10 years at the Mare, and
But,
I'm beginning to
yeah.
fall in love with them a bit, because
Yeah.
they are simplistic, but they have got a certain style about them. I don't find them as objectionable as people seem to say. Oh, high rise, it's not necessarily objectionable. I mean, obviously there are better ways to do things, but
Unfortunately, we've got a Jersey Flat Earth Society.
we have.
Yeah, which is sort of not an open organisation, but it's sort of a connection between various conservation groups and various people who are quite influential in the island. And they actively prevented building high.
Exactly
in the
what they
past.
keep saying about, oh, town should be 6 floors and no more, or whatever.
Yeah, that's
7
right,
floors,
yeah,
no
yeah.
more, as though. It's not Paris. I mean, I know Paris has tried that, but even Paris has got some high-rise buildings, not many. But this hard and fast rule is, you have to adapt to the circumstances, I would have thought.
That's right. Yeah.
Can architects really not force the issue a bit? Can you? I mean, you are a powerful group. You are integral to the design process. You meet all the right clients.
Well,
Can you twist a
think-
few arms?
we need to get the structure in place first, outside the architectural profession, inside government, and have somebody that with the power to actually drive supply of housing. Because at the moment, okay, the Environment Minister rezones a few fields, and then it's left up to the private sector to sort themselves out with it, and some of them come forward for housing, others don't, but of course it's being done by developers or quango developers that have got a financial structure that they have to perform to, and they will do what they think the market needs, not what the island needs. Yeah.
I mean, they've had all sorts of innovation schemes like housing organisations, the equivalent of trusts in the UK. And I haven't, not from where we're all at a distance over here, but I haven't seen the price of houses. There's not a stock of houses at a reasonable price. Generally, in the key areas in Britain, the housing prices are becoming astronomical as well. So it's not just a localised thing for Jersey, it's fairly
not.
general.
Yeah.
So there's a failing, whether it's the professionals, whether it's the developers, whether it's government, but somehow, I mean, people have a need, don't they? It's real. It's real.
I put it at the door of the government. Really.
Would you?
Yeah, because that's where real change can be made to happen. Somebody that drives forward supply of housing, funded by the government, and then drives forward innovation in housing.
When you say innovation, that's a lovely. I mean, for example, just coincidentally, the sand production has ceased in the island. Now, if you build in concrete, sand is an integral part. Now, of course, with climate change and everything else, there are a lot of people say, well, we're not going to be able to build in concrete anymore. Is that the sort of innovation which could lend itself? I don't say that's the only thing, but that sort of innovation, different thinking about providing housing which uses more timber or uses more recyclable materials to bring the price down.
Well, there are alternatives to concrete, which is still concrete, using different kinds of aggregates and reclaimed cement, or alternative to cement called GGBS. So you're not going to get away from concrete.
You don't think so? Well, a lot of
Or steel,
indigenous peoples around the world do. I mean, there used to be a
Yes.
wonderful exhibition which used to talk called Architecture Without Architects, which just looked at the indigenous buildings. And it was a
but
big
high-rise depends.
well, houses on stilts and all sorts of to suit local needs and conditions.
Yeah.
Now, for some reason, we've got ourselves into a bit of a design fix, haven't we? We see what we think is a house, and that's what we've got to build, but it's not necessarily so. I mean, I live in a high rise. Now, that's not what they would have said was a house 100 years ago. That would be, well, I don't know what they call it. Unless you can put cows in there, I think that's the mentality in Jersey.
So they call it a tenement. don't they?
Well, Glasgow tenements, the classic phrase, they were always 6 or 7 or more floors. They
That's
were quite
right.
tall buildings.
Absolutely, yeah.
But they're prized possessions now, if you go into
Oh,
Glasgow.
they're very chic.
Aren't they?
Yeah.
So,
Loft apartments, you see, have been all the rage recently.
as long as they've got lifts that work,
Well, that's true, yes.
which is another subject we discussed, because that's another aspect of the housing. I'm quite happy at Lamari. I'm a single person. They've got lifts which now work, but if they haven't got lifts that work, if the lifts fail, it's a real problem. And there are a lot of retired people living in those flats. I guess they suit them very. I went to, somebody invited me to their flat and they were just fitted out. It was fabulous, absolutely fabulous. I have to say, it was furnished beautifully, fitted out beautifully, and they were proud of it. They would be proud. Anybody would be proud of it.
Yeah.
So they are perfect living spaces for the suitable person, somebody who wants to live in that sort of accommodation, which suits me fine.
Yeah.
I would hate to be on the ground having to dig a garden. I would hate that.
Yeah, but you see, families, I think, is
Yeah.
where the crux of the issue is in terms of housing provision in the island. Families need outdoor space. Yeah, they need amenity space, and
What do they?
well, they do for play and for recreation.
Yeah, they do, but they've just been like, watch
Relaxation.
this. Well, I mean, I won't be rude to one of your colleagues, but I'd love to be rude to one of your architectural colleagues. A hideous building with very little usable space and very little usable private space, because it's all communal. It's like being in a prison, literally, because all the communal activities are supervised. You can't have private space, because that's a luxury when you start going. That one's about 5 or 6 floors, I think. That is not. I mean, it will have to suit families, because the families will move in there. But it isn't that sort of traditional dream of a house, 3-bedroom house with a garden. It isn't that, is it?
You see, that's uniquely English, that dream.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist elsewhere. Yeah, most of the Europe live in flats.
Well, I've never been to Venice. Have you been to Venice? What goes on behind the facade? What is the accommodation? It's not 3 beds with a garden, is it?
No, it's not. No, it's 3 beds with a pool or a canal.
Right.
But of course, you've got the wonderful public squares. You know,
Right.
So, the ambience is.
But
is
public
completely different.
squares.
But in France and Italy generally, it's multi-storey high-rise living.
It is.
For most people, and the dream, the English dream of sort of 3 beds and a garden, it doesn't exist.
And also, there's another thing. Ownership is not so great in a lot of continental countries.
No, that's right.
Renting is a
Renting
norm.
is-
That's not it's not social stigma to be renting.
No.
So these are the sort of hurdles in our own mind, aren't they, in a sense?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I don't think spending a life renting your living accommodation is a good thing. Not a good thing, because you never gain an asset.
Right.
And I think buying your house, paying off the mortgage as fast as you can, and then you've got an asset that's there which will see you through your later years, is the way to go.
Is that necessary?
Yes, I think it is. I think it provides security for families. It provides a vested interest. You've got a vested interest in keeping the place maintained and looking good.
I mean, I've never wanted to own a property. I've always found this very strange, because that's a hurdle. That's a thing around your neck which you have to overcome. And when you get old, and as people I know, and people my age, struggling, £60,000 a year to go into care or to fund your care, to have 2 carers in per day. The old dream as an asset, a house as an asset, is a bit of a farce, really, isn't it?
But that can provide or fund your care in later years.
But you don't own it anymore.
Significantly.
It has to go. You have to resell it or do something with it to raise the cash.
No, there were ways of doing it. There's various options.
Well, the British government's having this problem now because they're trying to raise a tax, which we've got here, which whether there's sufficient fund in the because we've discussed it before about the ageing population. But from an ageing point of view, the housing stock is very inadequate because most of the accommodation isn't suitable for disabled persons.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got a very bad leg at the moment. Simple staircases is a real problem for me.
Yeah.
Now, and that's a normal house. Most houses have got staircases,
Yes.
which isn't complicated. And even getting in the bath is a problem. All these things are not, the design process isn't geared up for the human species as they are, born as babies. And I just wrote a thing this week about, they were on about nappies, the huge nappy disposal problem. But what disposal facility is there in a normal house for getting rid of babies' nappies? Nothing, is there really?
There's bins.
There's bins. Yes, they finish up in the
bins.
They finish up in the pollution chain, don't they?
The energy is recovered.
Well, that's the thing.
But I think that's people's convenience, isn't it? Using disposable.
It is, but it's filling up the sewage system with muck, and it's also polluting the sea with all these little carbon fibre. I mean, that's the sort of process. I mean, we're into climate change and all this, but our architects, do you ever meet with the architects and say, what are we going to do about climate change and all these pollution problems? Do you ever discuss with architects?
Oh yes,
do you?
Yes we do. Yeah, and we're very keen on initiatives with design helping to avoid climate change.
Right.
Higher insulation standards than the minimum required.
Right.
Eco-active buildings.
Right.
We have lectures on that topic as well.
Well, I haven't seen what your lunchtime chats are about. I missed those. The last one I saw, ironically, was on insulation. Of course, that was just after Grenfell. Of course, that was another disaster in itself.
That's right.
So there are all sorts of pitfalls out there.
Because of COVID, the Association of Jersey Architects have been holding online seminars.
Have they?
Yeah.
Oh, right.
And I'm not too sure how widely those are circulated. You'd have to ask the secretary.
It's a pity they're not out there for the general public to participate. I would think. I mean, I didn't know they were taking place at all.
Yeah.
But I've got an interest. I mean, there's not a very high percentage of the population, but it needs to be encouraged that people know it's not what's happening in the world, what's happening here in Jersey.
Yeah.
And I think the public would go along with you. It's not for me to tell the architects what they can do, but I certainly make suggestions what they possibly could do about these sorts of things. Education, the educational aspect of architecture, to me is sadly lacking. Of course, there's no College of Architecture here. They have a Highlands College that's more technical sides, but not the aesthetics, the design.
Well, Highlands College is mainly providing training in the crafts, basically, not in architectural theory or in architectural design. And so we do lack that.
Yeah, I mean, that was why that seminar, or the prizes, I forget what the competition was, the UK's top architects were here giving that presentation at the Radisson. It was an excellent idea. Of course, it would be nice to have something.
It was Architecture Week. I organised in 2006.
I mean, it was an excellent, because you had some very good architects, you had some very good buildings, UK buildings, which were being appraised and discussed. And that's what needs to happen. But
we had the Sterling Award day.
The Sterling Award, that was the Sterling one. That's Sterling.
Where we had a range of UK architects discussing the project.
Exactly.
Or presenting their own projects, in fact.
Indeed, there was some very good discussion.
It was very interesting.
They didn't like my overactive presentation, I don't think, but that's me.
You're always a bit of a thorn in the side.
Well, a lot of that stuff is. I've got the camera with me today. Obviously, a lot of that stuff is now recorded. It's there. It's there. I mean, you've got people in the architect. There was a guy at one of the presentations I went to. He'd been to Brazil, and he'd been looking at the architect Brasilia, and he produced a fabulous video of Brasilia, with a Jersey frame of mind.
Local architect.
Yeah, local architect. And it was fabulous. He'd been out there. It was fabulous.
It was very good.
It's a shame that we haven't got more of that to encourage people to look at buildings, not just whether they're granite or not granite, the actual function of them. And I mean, you say you can build tall buildings, and I'm sure you can build tall buildings.
Yes.
But there are examples around the world, like Brasilia is an example, where they've got all shapes and sizes of buildings. We don't necessarily want Brasilia in Jersey, but there are examples around the world of very successful tall buildings.
Yeah, I always look back at the biggest thing that Jersey lost in the architecture terms was Eric Kuhn's
Right.
original scheme for the
Right.
waterfront when it was the
Right.
Waterfront Enterprise Board. And David Margerson, who was the managing director, invited me to have a look at the model
Right.
of the scheme, which was 3 sails.
Right.
I mean, these were tall buildings. These were iconic buildings that would be world class, and I thought they were fantastic.
Right.
I said it's brilliant, you know, because what they did was leave all the space around them on the waterfront for recreation, for
Right.
people to enjoy. And so it was a very sort of lean scheme in that you know, it went up high to leave the space free around. But unfortunately, the Jersey Flat Earth Society got to work and
Right.
stopped that happening. But what did we really end up with on the waterfront, Castle Quay?
Right.
Yeah,
That's
6,
right.
7-sided
I know.
slab buildings, filling the space
That's right.
with very little public space between them.
Well, well, if we go and look at Le Marais, there's a big green space in the middle, but it's not used really. It's got a little children's play.
Well, that's a shame. I mean,
It's because people, they can't go and make a noise. No ball games, that's always the first time that goes.
yeah.
You know, so they kill the space. I mean, you know what you used to do when you were kids? You used to build dens and go and wreck farmers' fields, all that sort of stuff we used to do. And they didn't seem to mind. I don't know whether the farmers...
You go to a private estates recently developed near Le Marais,
Right.
and they've got a central green,
Right.
and with kids playing football. You know,
Right.
there's no ban on it in the private
Right.
estates. What's the problem?
I don't know. I don't know what the problem is.
So why do they ban it in the public estates?
I don't know.
I mean, that's one thing that could be changed. And that central green at Le Marais could be made so much nicer with some
It
decent
could.
planting.
Yes,
around
it's just
it.
grass. I mean,
It's
the
just
grass is
grass,
nice,
you know,
and I'm glad somebody
to-
cuts it for me. I don't have to cut it.
Yeah, yeah.
And we did try to get the Bulls pitch there, but
Did you really?
yeah, we couldn't. The public weren't interested. I actually had some quite hostile responses from people that didn't want it.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a shame.
I've suggested, why can't we have a little cafe in the middle there? No, we don't want a cafe down there. It's a sort of...
But
because-
haven't Andium tried to promote it? You know?
well, they helped us with the balls and things like that. They tried to encourage that. They did, in fairness to them, but they don't. People, I mean, I suppose I don't. I mean, these are specific aspects of why design fails. I think you don't get that. You can't artificially create organic growth. You can't do it. It has to grow somehow. I don't know how it does.
That's go from people, doesn't it? Wanting to
That's
get
right.
involved in the community, having a nice space to enjoy outside, rather than being shut away in their box.
When I look out of my building down there in Le Marais, I can see all these streets, and it all looks like a big village. It's got the shape of a big village.
Yeah,
But it isn't a village. There's nothing there apart from houses. That's all it is, houses. No activity there. It's like little filing cabinets, but it's a low level. Now, I don't know. Can architects overcome that? Can they insist upon it? I don't know.
We can help create we can create the conditions to provide for the community involvement, to provide for that interpersonal activity, but we can't make it happen. I mean, that's down to the individuals, isn't it? That's down to society. So, I mean, architects reflect in the buildings the various parameters. One of those parameters is a sort of society. You know, we've got these regulations that we have to fulfil in terms of crime prevention. Yeah, well, you know, that's not really our job, but we have to still do a check on whether
I remember
there's
Dan
issues.
Fox used to lecture us on crime prevention.
Yeah.
The things he used to provide were not very socially acceptable to us.
Absolutely,
Lots of
that's
barbed
right.
wire and, you know,
Yeah.
very unpleasant things.
Yeah, everything apart from the gun turrets in the corners.
Exactly.
Yeah, but we have to weave our way through the regulations and make sure that our scheme meets the criteria that planning set, that building control set, and that other states department may have an influence over. So, to a certain extent, we reflect what society is doing, what government is doing, what society is doing.
So, multi-story, multi-floors, where and how high, as far as you're concerned?
Oh, 30 stories.
30 floors.
30 stories, 40 stories.
Right,
Slender, well designed,
right,
with green foliage on the outside,
right.
and sky gardens. Absolutely.
Right.
But they need to be well designed, and I think that is the criteria that should be applied in terms of approving them. Location is important as well, clearly, because you want some separation between these towers. Yeah.
Not on the flight path, presumably.
Not on the flight path, no, but it depends. There's not so much of St Helier that is within the direct flight path, but only that can be sorted. But yeah, so there's opportunities coming up with the waterfront, with the other areas where you could get a few towers in.
Do you think many architects share that vision?
I think some do, yeah. It's not something we've debated an awful lot.
Can we stimulate such a debate?
Oh, we certainly can.
Before the next election?
Hopefully.
Would any architects be standing for the States? I know one or two, in fact, have. They have stood.
We've got an ecologist standing for the States.
Right, okay, well, that's...
Nice guy, PS, and so
Right.
on, yeah. I don't know whether any architects want to stand for the States.
I mean, you think the government is part of the integral problem? You think that's the problem?
Absolutely, yes.
I'm not convinced it is, because
Yeah,
I
I
think
think it's...
government's become more and more weak, I think, and I think a decent lobby group, architects or other groups together, would have a great influence if they were to...
Yes, but I think we need to influence the government to set up the parameters in place, the structures in place, to make it happen.
No.
Because that's where the power is, the funding is, and without that, I mean, we'd be like a voice crying in the wilderness. It needs to have the enthusiasm and drive to solve the housing problem and use innovative ways of doing that in the centre.
Anything else you want to tell me?
So,
You've frightened them enough, I think, with your 30 floors.
no.